Hello! I'm LegenTerry, and this is my review of Senua Saga Hellblade II, a narratively focused action-adventure game developed by Ninja Theory and published by Xbox Game Studios. Well, after so many years, we finally have it in our hands. Believe it or not, Senua Saga Hellblade 2 was the very first video game used to showcase the potential power of the current generation of Xbox, all the way back in December of 2019. Yeah, realizing that, it's already been about 5 years, sprouted a bit of extra gray hair in my beard too. This game is the direct sequel to Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice. Definitely not confusing anyone at all with the similarities in alliteration. So just to keep it simple, I'll be referring to the first game as Hellblade 1 and the sequel as Hellblade 2 from here on. And cutting the jokes just for a moment, if you're looking to play these games, they both deal with a lot of heavy themes, like mental illness, human conflict, abuse, torture, and slavery. They're not necessarily made for people to have fun, but rather to share in a narrative experience. The first Hellblade told the story of a Celtic warrior named Senua living in the 8th century, who suffered from an extreme form of psychosis. Now, if you don't want any more information than that, go to the timecode on the screen, or stop here, play the first game, and come back. It's pretty short. For everyone else, I'm going to run down the story as a refresher, okay? Let's begin. The first game showed how she was outcast for the unfortunate mental condition she was burdened with, often hearing voices in her head and struggling to cope with the death of her mother. This was on top of the abuse she suffered at the hand of her father, a holy man who called her state of mind a curse. Until she fell in love with a man from another village named Dillion, who treated her illness as just another part of her, and put the voices in her head to rest. For a short time, she had some hope that things would get better, until a plague ravaged Dillion's village. Hearing her abusive father's words ringing through her, she believed that her curse was the source of the plague. So, against Dillion's wishes, she exiled herself from the village for a year. On her return trip, she met a man who was dying named Druth, who had once been a slave to the Norsemen. Before his death, the two became friends, and he told her stories of the Norse gods that his captors worshipped. Returning to the village, she found that everyone had been murdered, and Dillion's corpse had been strung up as a sacrifice to the gods. This utterly broke her, and she believed that Hela, the goddess of the underworld, had taken his soul. Tortured by the voices of her psychosis, she found her way to the gates of Helheim, killed Surt and Balravin, but was cast down by Hela. She then followed the voices of Druth and Dillion to a tree housing Grommer, a sword forged for Odin that's said to be powerful enough to kill gods. Through many trials, she fought through the sea of corpses, past the guard beast Garm, and back into Helheim with the blade. And then she was faced with repressed memories from her past. Her mother, Galena, had suffered from the same psychosis, and her father was the one that burned her at the stake for it. Against the endless forces of Hela, Senua was overwhelmed, and attempted to bargain with her, to sacrifice her own soul for Dillion's. And as Senua accepted death, she realized that it was never going to be possible to bring Dillion back from the dead. Her corpse and Hela's traded places, Senua walked away telling the player that there were more stories to tell, and the game came to a close. By the end, we were all left with some nagging questions. How much of what happened was real, and how much of it was fabricated by Senua's schizophrenia? Did she succumb to madness, or did she actually slay the Norse gods? Where the first game was more of a lonely journey about Senua's acceptance of her illness, the pain of her upbringing, and the loss of her loved ones, the second Hellblade asks, what happens when she comes across other people in need? It has an ensemble cast consisting of Senua and 3 other members, each of whom are facing a struggle for survival in their own unique ways. Raiders have sacked Senua's village and others, taking their people as slaves. Undead drauger and giants have ravaged the land, destroying any hopes of civility among the human population. And Senua is still fighting to quell the voices in her head, to take up a role as a leader and prevent more senseless death. Now, I'm going to delay any further talk about the plot until later, because there are some other things that I want to get to first. I'm going to start with the good and then work towards the less good, where I'll probably upset some folks. To begin with, this game is drop-dead gorgeous. It is one of the most visually breathtaking experiences out there, and it's not hard to see that a lot of those years Ninja Theory spent in development were probably dedicated to honing their skills in Unreal Engine 5. Hellblade 1 was beautiful as well, sure, but the presentation of the sequel toes the line between video games and cinema unlike anything else I've seen. It really feels like they pushed the medium forwards in terms of animation quality and graphical fidelity by a pretty hefty margin. To be clear, in case you missed it, I played on Xbox Series X, and all the footage that you're seeing is from that playthrough. The devs have pulled off a little bit of clever trickery to reduce the amount of processing the visuals take, like implementing mandatory letterboxing, which drops the actual resolution of the image on screen to something more manageable for the console's hardware. Once you notice those big black bars, they become pretty hard to ignore, and you're gonna feel however you feel about them. To me, I kind of expected the opening of the game to play out for like 20 to 30 minutes, a big story beat to hit, and then the bars would eventually shrink away to a standard widescreen format for the rest of the game. But no, they are there forever, which left me feeling a bit disappointed. But I totally understand. They wanted to draw as much blood from the stone as possible. The game's available on PC as well, and if you have a beefy enough machine, I'm sure you could eke out even more clarity and maybe even mod out the letterboxing. I forgot to write a segue in the script, so I'm just going to toss this in somewhere and hope it isn't too disruptive. Do me a huge favor and maybe hit like on the video or leave a comment, even if it's mean, and maybe consider subscribing. Anything helps to feed YouTube's algorithm. Thank you. Back to the review. Hellblade 2 does set dressing and environmental detail very, very well, and I'd say that it's probably the defining feature of the game. Senua's journey takes her to a few different locations across ancient Ireland, and each one is distinct in its appearance and beautiful enough to frame and hang on a wall. The beginning of the game sees her climbing jagged edge cliffs soaked in rain and ocean spray, which leads into a beach covered in black sand and stones while terrifying thunderstorms explode overhead. And before too much time passes, you'll be traveling with her across the famished wilds of the alpine tundra, through damp, mystifying caverns bearing supernatural lights, and into foggy, maze-like woods that disorient the senses. Now, the graphical quality would mean nothing if the art direction and the animation didn't help to sell the full vision. Melina Juergens has returned as Senua's voice, face, and motion capture artist, and she's done a remarkable job stepping back into the role, digging deep into the well of emotions that the character has been steeped in. Senua's journey has not been an easy one, and all of that is able to be seen through her facial expressions and her body language. In conversations, it's clear that she's still grappling with her inner turmoil, still unsure of how to trust her own thoughts and the people around her. And in combat, the physical stress and agony she's enduring as she swings her blade and meekly dodges around blows is evident. In fact, according to Dom Matthews, one of the heads at LegenTerry, their stunts and animation team spent around 70 days just doing motion capture work for combat sequences. And to put how much work that is into perspective, it's rumored that they spent less than a week on it for Hellblade 1. When you see the final result of all that labor, it's absolutely mesmerizing. Animations flow extremely naturally between each moment. Senua's sword will glance off of her opponent's weapon as she ducks off sides to evade a brutal attack, and then follows up with a combination of heavy swings to break the enemy's guard. Killing blow animations that follow the end of each fight are almost always unique. I think I only noticed 1 or 2 instances where they were used more than once across the whole game. And when one enemy is defeated, they employ some really intricate camera work to show the next one entering the fight with its own animation made exclusively for that juncture in the fight. Hellblade 2's display of visual delight is only its first line of offense though, as the audio pushes for a second, more aggressive strike on the senses. The game flashes a PSA on boot up telling you to wear headphones for the best possible experience, and there's definitely a reason for this. Ask anyone who has experienced the first game about it, and they will practically beg you to follow these instructions. As the one pulling Senua's metaphorical strings, you are constantly bombarded by the voices in her head and all the other auditory hallucinations she experiences. LegenTerry has once again invoked their 3-dimensional audio sorcery, giving you a small taste of that acute paranoia and anxiety our leading lady feels. The voices, or the Furies as they were once referred, are played by returning voice actresses Abby Greenland and Helen Golan, a role that seems almost abstract by nature, and relies completely on their ability to cooperatively improvise lines based on any situation. Sometimes the pair act together to amplify Senua's inner dialogue, expounding on her thoughts about a particular subject and lining up the questions she wants answers to. Other times they act as competing ideologies, trying to convince her to choose one option over the other. While their vocal performances remain strong in Hellblade 2, I do feel like their overwhelming presence has been dialed back slightly from their original appearance in Hellblade 1, something that I personally think is probably an improvement for the player actually experiencing the game, if I'm honest. I went back and rewatched a bunch of footage from the first game to remind myself of what happened for this video, and yeah, you probably forget just how chatty they actually were. And I mean, narratively, it makes a little bit of sense. By the end of the first game, she started to accept them as a part of herself, rather than as something she needed to extract or suffocate. So they got a little bit quieter. Now, there's a lot of other interesting audio stuff going on in there too, but spoiling more plot points is not what I feel like doing today. What I will talk about briefly is the music, and the impact it has on a few select moments, because, damn, it really helped drive the intensity up a few notches. We're talking booming, pulse-pounding percussion sections, tribalistic chanting, and vocal harmonies accompanied by strings almost all the way down. I'm sure many of you saw Heilung performing the main theme of the game called Seder, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, at the Game Awards last year. It was one of the highlights of the night, which is surprising because normally I'd say that music numbers at conference shows don't really hit too hard unless you're actually there in the audience. Anyways, there don't seem to be any other full tracks from the band present in the game, but from what I can tell, they did do a lot of the ambient music and vocalizations throughout. That might be disappointing news for fans of the band, but hey, the game is only like 6 to 7 hours long, they can't just stuff a whole album into it. But what is there sounds great. Now, the time has come for a bit of a reckoning. Positivity is going to shuffle its way past the elephants in the car and jump into the back seat for a while so my criticisms can take the wheel. I did not enjoy a lot of my time with Senua Saga Hellblade II. Let me explain. There are a couple of different lenses that I critique games through. Firstly, I appreciate video games as a form of entertainment, which is what I feel like most of the world also views them as. A distraction from everyday life to have a little bit of fun. Second, I see them as a collaboration between many different forms of art, which all come together to make something unique that you won't find in any other medium on its own. These aren't just stories that are being told to you, they're stories that you become a part of by walking a mile in someone else's shoes. However, if a game doesn't manage to bridge that connection between entertainment and art with a decent helping of interactivity, it starts to feel like a compromise of what the definition of a video game is. This is where the term walking simulator came from a while back. To be 100% transparent, I don't use walking simulator as an insult. Games can be whatever they want as long as you're in control of some aspect of them. And while I don't think the Hellblade 2 lies within the threshold of what it means to be a walking simulator, it does tiptoe gracefully around the edges. This game has environmental puzzles and some combat, but about 90% of the gameplay can be reduced to hold forwards on the stick to walk and hold a button to sprint while exposition happens around you. If you played Hellblade 1, the puzzles and combat feel exceptionally similar. There are only two forms of puzzles, one where you find the correct perspective to line up a symbol in the environment, and one where you use Senua's focus to switch platforms between two binary positions. That is all you get. And as for combat, it's exactly the same with one minor exception, which I'll come back around to in a minute. It's extremely simple and can basically be looked at as a game of rock, paper, scissors. Block or parry normal attacks, dodge away from the heavy attacks, and use your own heavy attack when an enemy is blocking to make them flinch, then mash light attacks until they eventually find their footing again. What I find strange is that, unlike in Hellblade 1, every single encounter in this game is a 1v1. I guess I could sort of accept an explanation like this makes every single fight feel meaningful and more focused, but it seems like a downgrade to me. There's less inherent difficulty because you just aren't worried about someone coming from the side or from behind you. You are instead intently staring at this guy in front of you, waiting for him to make the wrong move over and over. While I think there might be less combat sections overall, they start to drag and get repetitive very fast because of this one odd choice made by the game director. And to add on to that, remember how I said every enemy enters the fight with its own unique animations earlier? Well, that kind of makes each battle feel like a running gag written for the Three Stooges. As soon as you shove your sword into the guts of one guy, another one's going to manifest just off screen and clothesline Senua, or she's going to try to save someone's life and get yanked away by a second guy, or a third enemy that shows up is going to clumsily miss Senua and tackle the second one, both somehow unable to find their way back onto their feet over the next few minutes as you fight the first one. Clearly, like very clearly, Ninja Theory were heavily inspired by the Battle of the Bastards episode of Game of Thrones when they built their combat system. But guys, not every single battle can be the Battle of the Bastards. It just doesn't work like that. It's like there's a Pez dispenser full of dudes somewhere waiting for you to push the button and release the next one. Each battle starts to feel like a parody of the last in a really goofy way that doesn't fit the tone of the narrative at all. And finally, we come to the story. And the first thing I want to impress upon you is that it didn't feel nearly as impactful as the original to me. Not in terms of character growth for Senua herself or for the player who's along for the ride. It starts off pretty compelling. There's a good hook, the direction makes sense, the stakes are set, and then it ends. I mean, I didn't think I would get all of my questions answered. Leaving some stuff up to personal interpretation is exactly how Hellblade 1 handled its conclusion. But this felt more like they yanked the rug out from under me. Like they ran low on dev time and had to scramble to cross the finish line with something really, really dissatisfying. I don't expect everyone to feel the same, but I was so let down that it soured the rest of the experience up to that point for me. The game took me about 6.5 hours to finish, going at around what I'd say is an average pace. Completionists will probably spend about 9 hours playing, but that's really it. A game's length doesn't necessarily equate to its value. I've played plenty of games that are like 6 to 7 hours long, which I would gladly pay $50 for. And I do think the amount of visual and audio work on display here merits the price tag. But most of those other 6 to 7 hour long games were really fun to play or left me with a strong impression by the end that I can still look back on fondly weeks or even months or years later. And this, unfortunately, it just didn't move the needle for me. Senua Saga Hellblade II is an enigma. It comes in a wrapper that's visually alluring and audibly stunning, but it fails to make use of the other parts of the video game medium in an interesting way. It tries adjusting its narrative scope to make room for Senua's new companions, but it loses the plot along the way and forgets that it's supposed to be her story right up until the final act. I walked away wondering what it would have looked like with less budget and more cohesive theming all around. A good presentation is nice, but the empty calories from eye candy can only do so much when I'm searching for a hearty meal. Senua Saga Hellblade II receives a 6.5 out of 10.